So the first memory I have of our next speaker, Will Keepin, is actually of flying in his little airplane when I was about 3 years old from Carmel Valley up to San Francisco and getting a spectacular view of the Golden Gate Bridge. And needless to say, it made a very deep impression on me. It's my honor to introduce to you someone whose work has had a deep impact on numerous individuals around the world. Will is the founder of the Satyana Institute and Gender Reconciliation International, which conducts training programs around the globe on gender reconciliation between women and men, and collaborates with the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation to implement gender reconciliation in South African universities. A physicist and whistleblower in nuclear science, he trained in transpersonal psychology and spiritual disciplines, East and West, and completed his certification in holotropic breathwork in 1990. Will has applied breathwork in his trainings for social and environmental leaders for 24 years. His books include Divine Duality, Women Healing Women, and Song of the Earth. His talk today is titled Breathing New Life into Social Transformation, Holotropic Breathwork for Social Change Leaders. Please join me in welcoming William Keepin.
I need to use this mic, right? No, this is fine. I can do it from here. So, good afternoon. I know it's late in the day, so thank you all for hanging in there with this long but incredibly rich day. And my deep thanks to Rick for organizing this, for Stan as one of my most important mentors. I'm deeply honored and privileged to be here celebrating the work of Stan and all of us who have been in this legacy. Becca mentioned that airplane ride. I just got to start there because sometime after I did the training with Stan, I heard that he might want to learn to fly airplanes. And of course, I said, well, I'm a pilot. I'll take you for a ride. And so we flew down to Half Moon Bay and sort of over the bridge. And then on our way back from lunch, I said, what would you like to see any maneuvers, you know? Because I'd done aerobatic training. And so he said, yeah, so we did a stall or two, and then I did a spin. Now, I don't know if a spin is where the plane, you basically go down like this, heading straight for the earth, and it pretty much looks like you're going to crash and burn. The first time my flight instructor did a spin, which was late in my training, I thought, get me back on the ground. I'm never going to fly an airplane again. It scared the hell out of me. But so I did a spin, and you know the windshield fills with the earth, the sky disappears, and the earth is winding up at you like this. And then you have to pull out of the dive, and you pull about 3 Gs coming out so you don't hit the earth. And I looked over at Stan, and he just kind of goes, kind of reminds me of a non-ordinary state of consciousness. So it's a great honor to be sandwiched between Ralph Metzner and Jack Kornfield. And it was interesting how Ralph began his talk because I was born in a town that facilitated that destruction. I was born in Los Alamos and raised in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where they invented the atom bomb and the hydrogen bomb. I knew a lot of these inventors personally. So you could say I realized at a young age that not all was well with these great pillars of science. Many of them were Nobel laureates. But you know, I knew their kids and I knew their spouses and I knew what went on inside their homes. And that told a lot. When I was 12 years old, we moved to Vienna for 3 years, and we were 30 miles from the Iron Curtain, and I was so shocked by the division. I couldn't believe it, and I read, what was that called? The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, cover to cover, 1,200-page book, at age 12 and 13, just because I could not believe something so horrible had happened. And when I read that book, I realized that this is recent. This is only 18 years ago that this ended. And then when I went back to Los Alamos and came of age and the psychedelic awakenings and things happened, and I realized that my town was creating the methodology to destroy the entire planet at the push of a button. That's what they do for a living. So like a good boy from that town, I became a scientist, but I also then became an anti-nuclear activist. And I won't go into all that evolution. Became an environmental scientist. But I want to cut to the chase here. So let me just say that I eventually shifted to work with gender reconciliation. And one of my spiritual teachers said, when I shifted from anti-nuclear activism to this work, she said, all you've done is you've gone from working with the outer nuclear energy to the inner nuclear energy. So the work that I've been doing since I trained with Stan in the late 80s, and actually I met Jack Kornfield at one of those weekends. Jack was one of our guests. And that was a very important weekend for me because he introduced us. I mean, I'd been doing some meditation, but Jack introduced us not only to silent meditation, but he modeled the blending of traditional science, Vipassana meditation practice with the cutting edge of psychology by collaborating with Stan in those insight and opening workshops, to which I went to a couple of those and co-facilitated a couple of those. And that was a very important opening for me. And that's in fact what we do at the Satyana Institute. We combine holotropic breathwork and principles with contemplative practice in all of our programs. So it's an honor here to be celebrating with Jack and with Ralph, who was one of my early teachers at CIIS. So what we do is we apply these practices for leadership in social change. I was an environmental scientist, so that's where the work began. I led a series of retreats for a number of years for environmentalists to help them kind of do their inner work and kind of heal the healer kind of thing. And just to give you an example of the many different experiences we had, we were doing one of these programs, Colorado Environmental Coalition, and there was a beautiful scientist there, early 30s. And breath work was a very hard sell, continues to be sometimes in these environments. It's like, what are we going to do? Lie down on the mat an entire day? Are you kidding? I remember one of them said, we have here a 3-day program with a half-page agenda. We usually have a 3-page agenda and a half day. What the hell are we going to waste our time for 3 days? So, it wasn't an easy sell with these diehard activists. And I remember this one had that attitude. What he did, he was a naturalist, and he was tracking up in the mountains in the Front Range west of Boulder, Denver. What's happening there is, of course, those beautiful mountain areas are being vivisected and carved up into 40-acre ranchettes with a great big mansion on them, and like there's 9,000 driveways just to the west of Boulder in Colorado, weaving their way through all of this. So what happens is that whole habitat is always somebody's backyard. The elk have nowhere to be. And so they're migrating to try to find a place to live, and he was working for the Nature Conservancy tracking these elk. He would go up for weeks at a time. He would take a tent and a backpack and binoculars and his little, writing out the notes and be out there for 3-4 weeks at a time. So anyway, we were doing this breath work, and in the middle of it, he had some tears and all of the usual things. And all of a sudden, he just erupted on the other side of the room, and I flew over there, and we're working with him. And he's on one hell of a ride. I don't know what it is, but it was intense, and he was screaming, and he was laughing, and he was just all over the place. And afterwards, when he opened his eyes, he had this fire in his eyes and this exhilaration and this terror. And he reported to us, he said, I became an elk. And he couldn't believe it. His whole scientific kind of ontological map was taken down in that one experience. He said, my hands became hoofs, my legs became the back hind legs, and we were galloping across the plain. And he was so exhilarated. So he had a full-on shape-shifting experience into an elk. And as we talked with him and processed it, we helped him to realize, you didn't just become that elk. Those elk are out there watching this offending species, destroying their entire habitat. And you're the only one of the 6 billion that comes out there and gives a damn. They invited you to take a gallop with them. He became one of the strongest advocates for breathwork in our future environmental retreats. So the other area where we've applied it strongly is what we call gender reconciliation. And this is a work that I found it initially within the context of the environmental movement, and then Cynthia, my wife, who's here in the audience, maybe you can just raise your hand, joined me 14 years ago, and so it's really a work that we've co-founded. But it began in the environmental movement really as a response to, quite frankly, sexual harassment that was going down between the men and the women. And these are progressive environmental leaders who are taking on the shadow side of industrial civilization. You know, that's what we do. We chain ourselves to trees, we go testify in the halls of government, we speak truth to power, but there's one thing we could not talk about, and that was what was happening between the men and women within our own ranks. So a group of us organized some early events. We called them Gender and Ecology. Are there parallels between the exploitation of the earth and the exploitation of the feminine? So we organized some of those early events, and quickly what happened was that the power of what we unleashed overwhelmed our little methodology, you know, little workshop plan, design, everything, and it all falls apart and blows up in your face. So that was when we realized, hey, we have a tool for this. Some of us did breathwork. I had done the training. I had, with Stan, late 80s, I was in that B group of the 2 initial 3-year trainings. And so we applied breathwork to this work of gender reconciliation, and that was one of the breakthroughs. Of which there have been different stages, and the work grew from there. And just to summarize it, it basically grew over the 90s as a response really just to address a need within the environmental community, but then it began to get noticed by others, and so it kind of grew. In 2001, we got invited to India and then South Africa, and it's kind of continually grown from there. About 3 years ago, the Tutus got interested because it was similar to the principles they applied in their truth and reconciliation work. And in fact, I had always been inspired by them and called it gender reconciliation, partly for that reason. And to our amazement, we met them, and then they came, his daughter, Po Tutu, came to one of our workshops, and last year we established a partnership with the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation to implement this work widely. And what we're doing is training facilitators. We've got trainees going in 4 countries now, and our work is really to train facilitators in this transformative work and train the next generation of leaders. So, but just to say, because just a few months ago, I got an email from someone who was one of those, the first workshop we did where we brought breathwork into the picture. And here's the email. And she says here, "It taught me profoundly how to transform rage into compassion. I've since understood that there's an almost equal relationship between the amount of anger, disgust, grief, etc. I experience and the amount of resulting compassion that is possible." So that was a hint. I assume she gave us something of that kind of feedback at the time, but this came 22 years later out of the blue. I had forgotten who she was, but I just received that. Now, what we do in the breath work is we apply the holotropic principles to group process. Normally, we think of breath work, you go in, you do a breath work session, it's that inner alchemy, right? And we're doing the interior work of the individual. We're essentially doing the same process in the collective. And in the same sense that in the breath work, we sort of integrate those parts of ourselves that we've split off and perhaps denied, less tidy, uncomfortable, grief, sorrow, you know, human weakness, whatever it might be, that we embrace the shadow, we integrate the shadow, and we become whole again. We're essentially doing the same process in groups and communities. So, and there's a profound, of course, as we all know, injustice and split between, across gender lines, between men and women, between hetero and gay and lesbian, and the whole unraveling, growing spectrum of gender. But just to give you an example of how this works, we had one of our workshops in South Africa about 5 years ago when we were starting the training, facilitation training, and we had one moment where there was a woman who told a very intense rape story that had happened to her some months earlier, and she told it with incredible graphic detail. It was very intense, and it was all I could do to keep the men in the room to even hear this. And afterwards, one of the young men who was actually in the training program was kind of shaking, and he said, I feel traumatized, and I don't know how to be a man anymore. And so we worked with him. We helped him to understand you feel traumatized because you have opened your heart to a pain that this woman, and in fact all women to some degree, carry by themselves, that you have now opened to your heart. You are now carrying a portion of that pain in your own being, and that is transforming your very identity as a man. And that's the essence of the work. When we experience within ourselves the pain of the other, then there is a healing bridge between us and that other. And that then creates a unity and the beginning of a healing. So he's actually one of our certified facilitators now and does this work in Soweto. And breathwork has given not only that sort of understanding of the transformational power of this kind of alchemical process, but also, frankly, as several have said this weekend, the raw courage. Just what Stan taught us about how to stay with the process, to go for the wound, to go right into the wound. And as we all know, God enters through a wound. And we repeatedly see these miraculous healings that come in so many different forms. And we also apply the breathwork itself. Just 2 weeks ago, we were at Omega Institute. We had a 5-day intensive on gender reconciliation. And there was a woman there in her early 60s, probably, on the Omega staff, actually. And she had a very powerful breathwork experience. We had a couple of our, one of our South African facilitators who was sponsored by Omega to come there. So she's a black African woman from Lesotho, which is the donut hole in South Africa. And she was sitting for this woman from Omega. And turns out that when this woman was in her late 30s, she had a very unexpected and tragic for her, had to have a hysterectomy. And she knew somewhere in her that, well, she realized in this breathwork session, because she went right back to that moment in the breathwork session, and there she was in that pain, facing this hysterectomy and remembering this incident. And somewhere in her, she said, I knew I'd never really healed it. I knew that they just did the Western thing. They cut it out and pitched it in the trash. And she said, I didn't know what was coming. But she said, I reached out to my facilitator's hand, and this African woman took her hand, and then suddenly she said, I just descended, and I descended into this African village, and there were this whole circle of shaman and male and female, and they came up to me, and they very carefully reached into my womb and pulled out my uterus. And they took my uterus, and each one held it like it was a sacred object. And they blessed it, and they passed it from one person to the next in this circle. And her uterus was passed all the way through this circle, each one of them blessing it. And then finally, they gave it back to her, and they put it back inside of her. And she said this was the healing she had never had. And that they had not only healed that incident in her life, but there was an energetic and symbolic restoration of her very capacity to give creative birth. Her birthing capacity was somehow also restored. Now, how do you can't program something like that. This is the beauty of the breath work. And we see the same process in relation to the gender reconciliation. The things that the people come up with in these healing rituals is astounding. And you can't program it. That's the beauty of it, is that when we connect, because what the breathwork allows us to do is to reconnect to the spiritual, the mythic, the archetypal, the imaginal realm, and awaken all those parts of ourselves that are so denied in this culture, and I'm telling you, particularly denied in the context where we often work of, government and parliament and activist groups, and scientific groups. That's not allowed. That kind of thing is too woo-woo. And the breathwork provides a powerful way to reclaim that. So another example is a Unitarian minister who lives in Oakland named Lowell Brooke. Wonderful person, came to several of our gender reconciliation workshops, had a powerful experience, and here is not just a mandala, but a whole body of artwork, paintings and statues that were initiated by 3 sessions of breathwork that she did with us in the gender reconciliation. Here, this was called Birth, and she had the experience of giving birth to the earth, and she says this, I was not a woman's body floating in space. I was space itself, shaped as a large, naked woman. She was in a birthing position, and unexpectedly I merged with her and found myself giving birth to the earth. I was the universe giving birth to the earth. My womb was the cosmic womb. And she then, this led to like 2 or 3 years of a whole series of paintings and statues. If you're interested, you can look on her website. It's becomingfree.com. I'll just show you a couple others. This one is called, that one was sort of the separation, and this one is a detail of it called surrender. She says this: all things return to from whence they came, form to form, essence to essence. She wriggles out of her fleshly body in fiery transformation. Completely surrendering her will, she dives back through the original cervix, sliding into perfect stillness, caught by the midnight hands of absolute now, dying and born again into boundless potential. Reminds me of Chris Bache's talk this morning. So now I'd like to ask that we turn off the recording, both the video and the audio. The next 2 stories that I want to close with, sorry, I got ahead of myself there. I don't yet have permission to tell the second one and may never get it, and I don't have permission to tell the first.